Chi-Town, yeah.
Drama.
What?
Purchase your tracks today.
Windy City. Welcome back. It's your host, Gabe Morales. Previously, we talked about strife that happened in the late 1960s to early 70s in Chicago and other parts of the United States. We talked about the negative impact of drugs on the community, as well as violence that sometimes occurred in riots in Chicago after the deaths of Bobby, Martin Luther King, and Malcolm X. Many of the more politically minded Latin Kings took pride in flushing out unauthorized drug dealers in the communities. Well, one must look a little closer when justifying their actions. Many times, these Latin Kings robbed those drug dealers, or they taxed them, or made them individual side deals with the agreement not to involve the entire organization so as not to take it down. King Papa himself said that he used to rob heroin dealers alongside Spanish Lord dealer Big Gato. However, eventually, both men started indulging in heroin, and they both developed addictions. King Papa evidently became very depressed with internal politics, namely Lord Gino's secret campaign against him. And by the late 1970s, he was a full-fledged junkie. He was not the only one. Many other Latin kings also fell into addiction, chasing the dragon, which many felt might cause their organization to collapse. It was in part due to this that the Latin kings created a constitution to regulate members' activities. But while they definitely took some L's and had some bumps in the road, the kings continued to grow. In June of 1971, a high-ranking king named Raul Gonzalez, better known as Baby King, who ran the South Side for the Latin Kings, had his own issues, as well as North Side leader Gustavo Hercules Lord Gino Colon, as both caught murder cases almost back to back. According to court documents, on June 20th, 1971, Baby King, also known as Rayo Gonzalez, was hanging out at an intersection on 24th and Sacramento in the Marshall Square neighborhood when he spotted Ernesto Villagomez in a car with several people. Gonzalez then fired bullets into the car, killing the driver and causing the car to crash into a building. His intended target actually survived, and it was only the driver that was shot and killed, who was Ernesto Villagomez's uncle, Bertil. Villagomez had been known to hang out with both Latin kings and bishops, but the kings and bishops were rival gangs at that point in time, and Baby King did not like the fact that Ernesto was hanging out with bishops, especially after Ernesto wore a shirt that said bishops on it. It is said that Baby King confronted Villagomez and told him he could not wear bishop's clothing, but Villagomez cussed him out. Then Baby King is said to have slapped him across the face. And that is when Ernesto Villagomez threatened revenge. So it appears to be a case maybe of who got off first. Gonzalez was later charged with the murder and sent to prison. Exactly 1 week later, according to court documents, on the night of June 27, 1971, Gustavo Colon was hanging out at Levitt in Potomac in the Wicker Park area. According to court documents, he and Florentine Brio Menendez spotted an individual named Glenn Burr and his sister and friends walking down the street. Mendez then shouted to Colon, "Hey, shoot that black motherfucker." And then Colon pulled a gun out and shot at them. According to this court case, Glenn Burr took off running, but Colon then shot him 3 times in the back, killing him. Colon then walked up to Verlinda Hamilton and put a gun to her head, gave her a big smile, and pulled the trigger. However, the gun jammed, according to witnesses. Now, supposedly, Glenn Burr was not a totally innocent victim. He was said to have been a vice lord, and even though they're supposed to be allies, since both gangs fall under the People Nation, there was no People or Folk Nation back in 1971. That didn't happen until the mid to late 1970s. So, with Baby King locked up and Lord Gino also headed to prison and King Papa under fire, the majority of kings felt that something needed to be done or risk the entire organization collapsing. When Gonzalez and Colon hit the Cook County Jail fighting their case, It is said that they got together with Manuel Diaz Rodriguez, Johnny Martinez, Eddie, Dino, and Sunchild. And these 7 Latin kings are said to have drawn up the Latin King Manifesto, meant to formally guide and organize Latin kings. Like I said, a lot of kings were becoming junkies, which meant they were at high risk to snitch to the police. So one of the biggest guidelines in the manifesto was no use of drugs unless it was marijuana. When the manifesto was written, King Papo voluntarily stepped down due to his heroin addiction, and probably he knew if he didn't, he'd be hit on orders of these 7 Latin kings who were becoming stronger and stronger. And even while a lot of people still respected and looked up to King Papo, he was becoming weaker and weaker. It was ordered that all addicted Latin kings kick their heroin habits immediately and turn in all their bags of heroin. And if they did not, there'd be severe consequences. There was to be no excuses, no exceptions. A lot of people wondered what happened to King Papo and think that maybe Lord Gino had him killed anyways. Baby King actually had a soft spot for him as he was a young protege of King Papo, so he was not suspect. But Lord Gino had been very vocal with other kings about his displeasure with King Papo, so many suspected it was he that had him killed. Another big player in the Latin Kings nation and evolution was Julio Compa Munoz. Said that King Compa was born in 1936, by far making him one of the oldest kings, perhaps the oldest Latin king member ever. It is said that he was one of the first 10 original imperials when they formed way back in 1954. According to court documents, on December 17, 1975, Compa was age 40 at the time and lived on North Maplewood. Victor Figueroa was living with Compa during the latter part of 1975, and he was 16 years old and was believed to have been a runaway. Where the prostitute Deborah Shack, age 21, half his age, lived with him since October, and she wanted money for her methadone treatment. So she went out to lure some men for sex. Deborah Sheck took the future victim, Peter Mobiles, to Compa's house and informed him that her John had money. Compa grabbed his .357 Magnum, and Deborah took a knife from the kitchen to put in her waistband. And then they went to Peter's car. When they arrived at the car, Deborah asked Peter if she could give her friend Compa a ride to Foster and Sheridan. Compa entered into the passenger front seat, and Deborah sat in the back. Once in the car, Compa put a gun to Peter's head and demanded money. Deborah then placed her arm around his neck and held the knife to his throat. Peter then handed Compa $20. Deborah told Compa that he had more money than that. So Compa directed Peter to remove his suit, and he complied. Compa threw the suit outside the car, and Deborah got out. Compa then shot him in the head. They picked up the suit and went home. By 4 a.m., they conversed with Ralphie Munoz, who was Compa's relative, who told Victor Figueroa what they had done. They went back to the car to cover up blood splatters and looked through the clothes, whereby they found $50 more. Later on that morning, at about 10 a.m., Compa and Deborah, along with Ralphie Munoz and Victor Figueroa, and an unknown driver, drove to St. Charles, Illinois, to the Illinois Training School for Boys. Prior to leaving, Compa retrieved his gun from where it was hidden in an alley. Compa's son was housed in St. Charles as a juvenile. Julio Munoz Jr. was also a Latin king. Both Compa and Deborah visited the son, and allegedly Compa told him about the murder. On the way back to Chicago, Compa threw the gun out into an open field. And according to the later testimony of Victor Figueroa, that was the same gun that was used in the homicide. Another individual who was a friend of Compa's was able to tell the police what cafe they were at the night of the murder. This cafe was a known hangout for prostitutes. Police detectives showed the cafe owner pictures of prostitutes, and the owner was able to identify Deborah. On December 24th, 1975, a police investigator went to Compa's house, where there were 6 or 7 people hanging out, and all of them were arrested. 4 days later, the investigator told Compa that Deborah had made a statement against him, implicating his guilt. While Deborah was held in the Cook County Jail in a female housing area, she received a letter from Compa implicating his guilt, which said, "Debbie, I know you signed the statement against me, and I realize that you were under a lot of pressure when you did this. So for that, you are forgiven. But you can also help me to get out of this mess simply by saying that you were under police pressure when you made the statement against me, and just simply change your story in court. By the way, Playboy is out on the street, and I don't think he is the one who told about Geneva, but it really doesn't make any difference who said it. The cat is out of the bag, if you know what I mean." Shock apparently did not want to be involved in the murder because she ended up testifying against Munoz. But this was not the only murder that Compa was involved in. Victor Figueroa had turned state's witness against Compa in August of 1976. Julio Munoz Jr. later held a gun to Victor's head and threatened his life for testifying against his father. Jr. was then charged with armed violence, and Victor testified against him also, which resulted in Jr. being sentenced to a year and a day in prison. He ended up testifying against Compa in August of 1976. And Compa was eventually convicted and sentenced to not less than 75 years and not more than 150 years for murder and sent to Stateville. Because of that testimony, Latin Kings made death threats towards Figueroa, forcing him into the witness protection program. Figueroa was able to escape the arm of the Latin Kings until February 23rd, 1979, when his luck ran out, and he caught 3 bullet wounds to the chest. His penis was also said to have been severed and shoved into his mouth. On February 23rd, 1979, Victor Figueroa's frozen body was found in an alley on North Francisco Avenue. Crime scene investigators found out that he had been killed approximately 2 days earlier. Anthony Little Half Pint Perez was later named as the killer. He was arrested on March 2nd, 1979. Perez initially denied killing Figueroa, but later on confessed to killing him with another Latin King named Black Jack. But Black Jack's real identity has never been revealed. So if this is true, there may be a murderer still out there. In 1977, the Latin Kings made news again when the Division Street riot kicked off on June 4th, 1977. This involved a fight with the Latin Kings against the Spanish Cobras. Joe Sparks told me that the Spanish Cobras stabbed a Latin King during the June 1977 Puerto Rican parade. This became the catalyst for Humboldt Park riots that lasted a day and a half. The Kings retaliated later that day. And as I mentioned in the introduction to Chicago Gangs video, Chicago police shot 2 Puerto Ricans, Rafael Cruz and Julio Rosario, after these gang fights.
It was a misunderstanding between 2 Latin gangs, so why in the hell, who called the cops to come in and instigate? Right away, they ask us, they tell us we all got to get out of the pipe.
After the riot in 1978, the Kings were operating strong with their new manifesto in effect and expanding on every level in neighborhoods all over Chicago and beyond. Ended up joining the People's Nation, which was an alliance of gangs, of which the Latin Kings were the biggest Latino gang. Meanwhile, as I stated several times, the Folk Alliance was created in 1978 after talks with Larry Hoover by various gang leaders. While this People Alliance worked well for the Kings when they're incarcerated, it did not always translate to peace out on the streets, and many gangs felt the Latin Kings were poaching on their turf. During the early 1980s, the Kings expanded into the back of the yards, Marquette Park, Gage Park, Brighton Park, McKinley Park, and other areas of Chicago, as well as out into the suburbs, where they expanded greatly. By the late 1980s, Latin Kings were documented in DuPage, Will, Lake, and Kane County, all suburbs of Cook County. Like I said, the Kings were allowed to smoke marijuana per their manifesto, but no use of hard drugs. That did not mean they couldn't sell hard drugs. And just as the crack cocaine epidemic was very big in Los Angeles and on the West Coast and all over the West, so was crack cocaine a big thing out on the streets of the Windy City. So, of course, as Kings were selling drugs and making tons of money, the feds and local authorities were able to create more cases against them. That concludes part 2. Part 3 will follow shortly.